This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, everybody, let's begin. We've got a lot to get through in the next 2 hours. Some bits of me and Lauren as well, and it's going to be action-packed. And we're going to start off with a bit of propaganda that I think you will enjoy. Pretty much tell you everything you need to know, actually, but then we'll explain to you how to think about it. It's, as you can see, a 1948 cartoon about the Newtown experience and concept.
Hello. Morning. My, this is a grand way to start the day. Bit different from what it used to be, I can tell you. I can remember like it was yesterday. Look, it wasn't half so comfortable. Took a bloke a good hour to get to work. That's not a view, if you can call it a view. You needn't ask when you were getting near the town. You knew without looking. Still, what would you expect with drab-looking houses and ugly factories? Not even a blooming place for the kids to play. Poor little blighters. Well, one day I was proper fed up with it all. It seemed to me we'd made a real mess of things in our town. Still, if you can make a muck-up of things, you can put them right. Boy, that's when I had a great idea. And it seemed I wasn't the only one. Oh, no. Let's start by seeing how our town looked 150 years ago. Small, compact, thriving, small population. Then the Industrial Revolution happened. Industry moved into the town. It needed workers. The town was now unhealthy and crowded. But as soon as new roads and railways were built, houses followed them and the congestion remained. In fact, our town has turned into a monster. The surrounding country is being eaten up bit by bit.
Well, let's stop to it quick.
Right. Then we'll have a green belt here, in which agriculture will be safe forever and into which the town will not intrude. That doesn't solve the problem, however. We're still overcrowded.
I say move out. Make a fresh start.
Stop. Don't do something you'll be sorry for later. Come back and let's think it over. If we're to make room for everyone without spreading out, we must build upwards.
Don't be silly, I never get the pram up there.
Here, hold on. What about my garden?
You've ruined my favourite topsail.
All right, all right. No skyscrapers. But before we can replan the old town, we must provide for the surplus population. Here, outside the green belt, we have a favourable site. Good road and rail communications, fresh air, good water supply. We must decide on its size in advance. And we must plan this town so that we don't repeat past mistakes.
First thing we all agreed on was to separate industry from dwelling houses.
Industry here, close to through roads and railways. Residential area here, with not more than 5 minutes travel from home to work, which means making cycle tracks and byroads linking up the two sections. Now, let's see what we need for good working conditions. Up-to-date factories with plenty of light and air.
We'll need room for expansion.
And good canteens too.
What we don't want is a lot of dirty smoke. You can keep that.
No, we can't always cut down the smoke, but we can site the factory downwind.
Our town was going to be a good place to work in and a grand place to live in, with plenty of open spaces, parks, and playing fields where people could enjoy it, flower gardens. And of course there'd have to be an attractive town centre too, with plenty of room for folks to meet. Good shops, a posh theatre, cinemas, a concert hall, and a civic centre.
We have to plan the residential area next. Let's consider it as a series of neighborhoods and take any one of them. Now, how shall we plan? Most important of all is the child. So we'll need pedestrian routes for the pram pusher. Nursery schools within 400 yards of every home. Primary schools within safe and easy reach. Each neighborhood must have its own
Benches,
community center.
shopping districts.
And lots of pubs. Right next door to me.
I know you don't.
Oh, there'll be a pub quite near enough to you. And finally, we started on the houses. The site was planned for maximum sunshine, and then everyone could take his choice.
Detached houses, semi-detached, terraced houses, flats for people who wanted it, hostels where the young folks could get together, and bungalows for the elders. And so we moved right in. I'm telling you, it works out fine. Just you try it.
Okay, so as I say, that pretty much tells you everything you need to know about what we're going to be talking about today. I want to give you a bit of a... please don't talk. It's really... I can hear it, and we probably all can. So I'm going to run through this stuff quite quickly. I'll give you a bit of context for that film, and also an Australian context as well for similar kind of topics, and also I guess for the possibility of discussion like going forward into the 21st century as well. Then Lauren is going to come in and give a really exceptionally brilliant lecture about one particular aspect of this particular topic, and possibly time depending we might move then into a discussion of the sort of the reaction against, for want of a better word, excessive planned environments in the mid to late 20th century, or we might hold that over to for a later week and incorporate that into another week. But we'll see how we go. So you've already had some detail on how planned environments or planned cities were regarded and used, and were often, I guess, you've got to stop talking, were used and understood and had particular utility for, particularly, I guess, for governments as they attempted to figure out how best to ameliorate and or solve issues of, particularly issues of industrial cities. But there's a whole extra range of problems that come up in the 20th century. And if you know nothing about the 20th century, you will at very least know that there were two major wars and a lot of minor wars in the 20th century. They had, these particular wars had precedents that spread, really touched. I'm trying to think, but almost every continent on the globe, or touched in some way every continent on the globe, and some quite cataclysmically. And you can make a kind of, you could talk about Japanese colonization in China, leading into the kind of the way that Japan was a colonizing aggressor. And please stop. Can you please stop talking? Stop talking. I can hear you. It's my place. I have to go out and come in again. No. So there's all kinds of ways in which planning, the story of planning, and the modernising element of planning is woven into these kinds of ideas of how to rearrange society, improve society, and further civilization, and perhaps fix major problems. So the Second World War in Europe is from 1939 to 1945, and as you no doubt know, had major impact on European life in whichever side you're on, and it also had major impacts in other parts of the world as well. But I'm going to concentrate largely on the UK and Australia in the next 20 or so minutes. So one city that was exceptionally damaged by Allied bombing was Coventry. And with the rise of the planning movement in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, we start to see a respect given to the planning profession and an expectation or an understanding that planning appropriate metropolitan environments is going to make a massive difference to people's lives, improve people's lives. There are the issues of the old and inappropriate housing and the conditions that people had previously lived under in, for instance, London or other major cities, particularly major industrial cities, and those conditions were seen to be very unpleasant and very unhealthy. One of the major incentives for the kind of funding and support of the planning movement, I might have mentioned this before, came at the beginning of the 20th century when it was realised in the UK that men in particular who lived in industrial cities were too infirm, too unhealthy to actually serve as soldiers. So once it became, it was, a double thing there. It was kind of, well, that makes the nation vulnerable to attack because most of the people who might otherwise be fighting in wars actually can't fight because they're too sick and they've grown up in such awful conditions that they're just being they're apart from anything else they're dying out or they're susceptible to disease and so on. They're not firm and strong enough to fight, and also it also feeds into that hole which we're very used to, and I think it's under the surface in many of these kinds of discussions then and also now, the notion of not just national pride but also the kind of the future of the race or a race in particular in this instance. So there's kind of concern for the future of a particular racial group. So when Coventry, for instance, cops it really badly in the Second World War and is damaged extensively, famously, there are a few things that come into play, and one of the things that by this time the government in the UK, who have taken Britain into war, they have adopted the idea that the British people need to be rewarded for their staunch, upright bravery and courage and tenacity in the face of adversity. There needs to be a better future promised for them in the post-war era. Coventry, and you can see from this model with all the charcoal buildings where all the damage was done in downtown Coventry, becomes a kind of an exemplar for how a place can or should be replanned in the post-war era. And here is a suggested plan. I think some certain principles of this were followed. Some of the great things that they have in Coventry, and this was created. This is the central shopping centre, the shopping precinct here. Now, somebody did actually tell me, and I've forgotten why the elephants are on the pillars. Do you guys remember? No one.
I don't think I even knew.
Lauren, I thought you knew everything. Okay. There is actually an answer to that, and I think it's easily obtained, but I thought I knew it and I realised I've forgotten. Anyway, and this is the interior of that shopping precinct, and the way that it has since been developed. There is all kinds of ideas put forward about how people might live in this new Coventry and what the the various components, the various ideal elements of an ideal home. And planners really, they come into play. There's so much vested in what planners can bring to and designers can bring to the new, the post-war Britain, if and when Britain wins the war. And this table, cribbed from Esther Charlesworth, is really useful for understanding some of those central principles whereby war destruction is often tallied or contrasted with urban decay and the problems that people saw as a war bringing and what a war might wreak on let's say on a city, but also on a people, and what urban decay might bring as well. So this is useful in the Australian context, because in Australia we didn't have Australia wasn't bombed in the Second World War, except Darwin. Darwin was bombed, but most of Australia was untouched by enemy artillery, and instead Australia was somehow swept up in the urban decay reconstruction story and the solutions. Australia was looking to solving major problems that were already endemic in Australian cities, certainly seen to be endemic. I think they probably were, and so a number of publications, for instance, were put together, particularly by F. Oswald Barnett, who I think I've mentioned previously, and um, Burt, who was another accountant, if I remember rightly, and in that second publication, Frank Heath, who is a major figure in the 1940s and 50s as a planning advocate and other things, secretary of the Town Planning Association, and so on. He's a big name in Melbourne at this time, and in fact, just after this photograph was taken, the year before, Heath was delivering the first set of lectures that formed part of the town planning diploma, the first such diploma held at this university. So that began in, I think, 51, when the Faculty of Architecture decided that it was the School of Architecture then, decided that it was going to, the time had come to move into planning. So what you're looking at here behind me is at least one of the many, 5 or 6 men, I think they were all men, who started out the planning program here at Melbourne. This is one of the things that Heath and his allies developed as a proposal for how Melbourne might develop, and here is one of the diagrams that was developed at the same time, looking at the parlous condition of places like North Melbourne, and to a lot of people at this time, just these intricate winding streets were awful enough in themselves. They spoke volumes in terms of immorality and unhealthiness. That same space there was discussed. This is the same space. Envisaged as a much more spacious. I'm sure you can see some connections between that and the Newtown film. The different kinds of housing, the spaciousness, the hygienic nature, and recreation space, and so on. Just as a comparison, something else that Heath was doing at this time was developing these expansion plans for regional Victoria, and these are in this case, I think this is the original Wangaratta up here, and the rest is expanded Wangaratta. He was doing these commissioned by local councils, not by state government, and it was a way that local councils would apply for funding, often from the Commonwealth Government, to expand on the decentralisation principle, part of which was, there's a few things about decentralisation which I guess I'll mention now. One is, it's of course it takes pressure off the central city, so it means that of those options that are shown in the Newtown film, everyone doesn't have to go high rise. People can still have that kind of quality of life, which is particularly seen then and now as part of the Australian way of life. That kind of ability to have a home and a garden and, not be right next door to your neighbours, that kind of stuff. I mean, I know a lot of you don't live that life, but that is still the way that most Australians live, and a lot of Australians think of that as their birthright, essentially. That's something that is going to take a lot of time to educate Australians out of that, educate in inverted commas, Australians out of that idea, because it is so strongly held as a central principle. Great, cold coffee. Okay. How would this kind of decentralisation would be, not only would it be about quality of life, it would also be about security, because almost immediately after the Second World War, we enter the Cold War, and there's a strong fear and belief, quite justified belief, that big cities are very vulnerable to attack, and that if everybody's concentrated, as they so often are in Australian cities, concentrated in just a few cities, then you can wipe out Australians pretty quickly just by wiping out those cities. If the population spreads out across the countryside, then it's much more difficult for them to be a target. So this is Australia, and as you can see from this image, one of the ideas is linking up all these new settlements with major freeways. It's hard to put across the utopian nature of this stuff now, but this was seen as like the ticket to freedom, I think. And also, in some ways, it's a part of the freedom that you get from winning the Second World War. It's also a bit of a celebration of capitalism too. So, Lauren's going to talk about this more and in greater detail, but I just want to try and incorporate that, the British example into this in some way. And we're still talking about roughly the same era. We're talking about the 1940s into the 50s. And we have a major campaign, really two campaigns, to two separate eras of new town development in Britain. In most instances, this would be true, wouldn't it, Lauren? In most instances, they tack them onto an existing settlement of some sort. No, I'm wrong.
In the sense that they're mainly villages.
Yeah.
There are, later they pick bigger cities, but there's usually nothing at all. But there might be like a 500 population.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. So it's usually a case of find a village, or perhaps being England, it's hard to walk too far in any direction without, hitting some kind of village, and then you establish a major new urban development there. Okay, so we saw the movie, and the movie was based. It was based around the first new town. So it was based around Stevenage, which was the first British new town. Stevenage, that was actually the town that was in quite, precise detail. We saw the plan of Stevenage there, although we didn't see too much about what it would actually look like, because I guess they didn't have a great idea of that necessarily then. This is the centre of Stevenage. This is Stevenage when I went there. This is the only picture I could find, but this is an interesting one because this is the. I don't know if it was developed for this, but this is presently it's the old people's residences in the centre of Stevenage. So if you're old and in some ways otherwise not as mobile as some, you can still live right in the heart of town and have access to all those services. I mean, if you're an old pensioner in Britain, you've probably got completely bugger all money, so it's you can just go and press your face against the shop windows and look at the pork pies or whatever. But that's how that was conceived. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about these things. Just to show you some of the imagery that they're putting forward to sell people on the notion of the new towns of Britain. And they were controversial from the outset. They were controversial amongst the people who previously lived in those areas, although they were a minority. But they were also controversial for all the reasons that you can imagine at the time. They were also very comprehensively promoted by people who were paid to promote them, and we saw the movie, and also by urbanists of the era. This is from Peter Self's book, the name of which I forget, but Peter Self was a noted commentator on urban issues in the 50s and 60s, and this is this image, these two photographs, the contrast in these photos. You saw the same thing in the Newtown film, like ride to work, an element of egalitarianism there in that ride to work as well. There's people of all classes rode to work, but it was a beautiful way to get to work, and it was refreshing, and you didn't feel all in, as we heard in the film. By the time you got to work, it wasn't smoky and appalling and disgusting, and the journey to work up there. I mean, how far have we come? It's about as bad in Melbourne right now, possibly worse in some ways. Other new towns. Often they were created. There's a wonderful film on YouTube about Runcorn, which I recommend to you. Beautiful colours. And they were often created on quite experimental principles. This Runcorn has a kind of a figure eight, not a ring road, what is that? It's a figure eight, isn't it? A figure eight road that goes around its two centres. Cumbernauld is and was an extraordinary experiment that I think in consecutive years, not that long ago, it won it won an award for being the worst designed thing ever, and then it won an award for being the best designed thing ever. So who knows the reality there? But with Cumbernauld, there's a whole shopping centre and a civic centre on top of this mountain, with the residences down the side of the rock that it's on here, and really extraordinary idea. Incredibly cold, apparently, and the one thing I will say about Cumbernauld, if you get a chance to see a film called Gregory's Girl, which was made in the early 80s, really remarkably funny and clever, still a great film today, still a lot of fun to watch, but also it's a great thing for you to watch because it was all filmed around Cumbernauld, and you get such a great sense of the place and the to an extent the people. So, to go back to Australia, so we have this in the UK. This is up until the early 60s. In Australia, we have all these concerns about how much of Australia is inhabitable. For some time in Australia, in the early part of the 20th century, it's almost a hanging offence to claim that Australia cannot be populated, extensively throughout, even in the desert regions or whatever. Science is going to solve all these problems. That hasn't happened yet. But there are a number of people. Here's Frank Heath's idea for a garden city coming about in stages at Calcallo. I don't know if you know Calcallo. It's not that far from where we are. It would be, on the very outer edge of Melbourne. Calcallo is, this is a Heath proposal for what he called a garden city on the railway line. You see, he's given it an airstrip and all the mod cons. This is Calcallo in 2012 when I visited there. This is a proposal for Calcallo, not Calcallo. It's going to be called Merrifield. Not quite sure where this is at right now. Last time I drove through there, it was certainly didn't look like this, but it was, finally, I guess the conurbation of Melbourne reached that stage. Those kinds of things not so successful, at least not to this point. Elizabeth in South Australia, a much bigger deal, and a successful new town to, in a certain way, to the British model, inspired by the British model, I would say, that was built outside Adelaide to attract particularly new migrants who would work in manufacturing, and a lot of factories were attracted there as well. Now South Australia tries again in the early 70s to create something they initially called Murray Newtown, and they go on to talk about it with the name Monarto. You can see it's outside Adelaide there, and they're quite a bit outside Adelaide. And their plan with Monarto is to, how are we going to make this work? There's a perceived need. There's the idea that Adelaide is going to get too big too soon. There's a perceived need, and how are we going to make this Murray Newtown function? We're going to ship all the public servants from Adelaide there, and they're going to live there. So there's an instant middle class with an expendable income. They're going to demand all the right things for their children and their own futures. I mean, if you paid attention to the news in the last few years, you will really be thinking about the notorious notion of Barnaby Joyce requiring that people in a particular government department all move to Armidale. I think 25% of them actually made that move, and everyone else was just like, no, I'm going to get another job, thanks, and stay living in Sydney or Canberra or whatever. So, the idea of forcing public servants to go to a particular place if they want to keep their jobs, a lot of people just go, well, actually, I'd rather have the quality of life of the big city than the job. But who knows what would have happened in Murray Newtown, such as it was. This becomes a big deal, first at the state level, then at the federal level in the early 70s. Here you see the Premier of South Australia, Don Dunstan, and Jim Cairns talking over a plan of this same city known as Monarto. Here's the plan in question, and some of the things. This is just the central part of it, which was, you know, a lake would be constructed, all these extraordinary buildings. There's absolutely nothing there. There's a town called Murray Bridge, not a million miles away, but essentially there's nothing at Monarto. And very quickly, I've done quite a bit of work on this, as you might be able to tell. There's very quickly there comes to be a sense amongst the people who are charged with designing Monarto that this is not going to happen. Because they get the revised estimates of population expansion in Adelaide, and they're like, well, you know, Adelaide is not actually, you know, going to blow out. It's going to remain the smallest mainland capital. Sort of true. I don't know if you count Darwin as a capital. I've always been confused about that. And it's so they have a lot of money, so they keep producing amazing plans and incredible ideas and visualisations, which go on to be, in many ways, quite influential throughout the 70s and into the 80s. So, you know, $30 million, which isn't much by our standards, although I wouldn't mind having it, but it's not a huge amount of money, but you know, it is, in some ways, it ends up being a great sort of think tank for how Australia might develop going forward. And here we have some of the literature that's developed, firstly by Kazansky and Associates, and secondly by John Andrews, the well-known architect. And here's Kazansky's notion for kind of iconic central buildings in Monarto, and all these questions come up. We're going to build a new town. What's going to make, not only what's going to draw people there, how's it going to be culturally, you know, valid? How's it going to have a cultural life? How's it not going to become, you know, instantly a kind of tarnished modernist slum? How do we make it a good place to live? A place, you know, what are the attractants? And part of that is not just what are the attractants of residents, but also what makes it a tourist attraction, and so on. And all of these ideas of what is it going to look like? What is it going to be? What's going to make it valid? What's going to stop it from being unrelentingly new? What's going to make it distinctly Australian in this case? You know, what's going to keep it not seeming like an alien creation? So, wonderful stuff. It completely dies. It dies as much as this dead elephant in this cartoon. And I think that the cartoonist here, whose name I forget, it's written up there in the corner, but I can't read it, is, you know, he's conflating a couple of metaphors there. I guess it's a dead elephant. It's probably a white elephant. It's an elephant in the room. It's not really in the room, but you know what I mean. And it's just a total disaster. So, well, it's not a disaster because it is cancelled before it really gets underway, but it still becomes a known example of why new towns can't work in Australia. And we shall see if the Australian Research Council funds the extraordinarily huge, unbelievably huge project that I've put in for funding for this year. Maybe I will be able to take this further, but not today. In Victoria, we have a slight version of that that push factor idea in that we do have the state government sending public servants to particular regional centres. So the Transport Accident Commission was relocated in Geelong, and I guess if you didn't want to live in Geelong, you could commute to Geelong every day and work there. But you know, it was kind of a tiny little version of that same idea of spreading things around the state and relieving some pressure on the central city. The reason that I have Ballarat here is because I think that in this state in particular, you know, Melbourne is growing massively all the time, even as we speak, and a lot of people in our own faculty live in regional centres like Ballarat and Bendigo and Castlemaine, and they commute every day into the city, which is, you know, I personally think not an ideal solution to anything, but it is a solution. If nothing else, it's a solution to the affordability problem in Melbourne. Still not a great solution because it's still quite expensive to live in those places, but substantially cheaper than living around here. So I want Lauren to come and talk about Milton Keynes particularly, and I think that you should just go for the hour and a bit, Lauren, and I'll
Not go, but
no come and
I could run away, but
don't run away, please.
Okay.
Don't run away. Don't leave me with these people, and and we'll deal with protest stuff next time.
Okay. There might be a bit of time for questions then.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was hoping. Lauren.
Okay. Do you want to? Oh, we're not wearing it.
No, you can if you want.
Okay. Okay, hi everyone. For those of you, I mean, I hope the people in my tutorials know me, because at this stage of the semester it might be a little bit awkward if you don't. But for those of you who aren't, my name is Lauren Pico. I have a PhD from the History Department here at the University of Melbourne. My background is not in planning at all, but how I would describe myself is as a cultural historian. So rather than looking at just what happened, I'm more interested in how and why it happened. And so my sort of geographical and chronological area of interest is mainly Britain and mainly after the Second World War. And my PhD was on essentially why the town of Milton Keynes is not very popular or has not been very popular in British society. So this lecture draws on that. It gives you much more of the sort of the facts of Milton Keynes' planning history than I would perhaps otherwise be interested in. I'm much more interested in why people don't like those plans, or think that they don't like those plans, and the sort of politics of how reputations of cities can change and how the reputations of planning can change. It's just a fun poll for my benefit. Does anyone, other than people who have read the subject guide and maybe had a look at the readings, has anyone heard of Milton Keynes before? Has anyone been there? Well, David did because I made him go.
Yes.
When he was supervising my PhD.
That's right.
Cried with joy at how wonderful the shopping
It's great.
centre is.
It's great.
What did you think of it, for those, if anyone feels, who put up their hand, felt like volunteering?
Pretty awful.
Pretty awful? What's awful about it?
Lots of roundabouts. Don't really know where you're going.
Roundabouts don't know where you're going.
Yeah. The sort of brick everywhere, concrete slabs.
Brick everywhere, concrete slabs.
Not particularly picturesque.
Where were
So-
you trying to go?
Not to Milton Keynes.
Right.
Trying to get out.
But there is a
Right.
snow dome there now, so
There is, yeah, which has a bar. It has an indoor snow slope with a bar, so you can sit there and have a drink and watch people fall down the snow slope, which is I think it's fantastic because I don't ski. But so was that the idea of Milton Keynes you had before you went there, or was that an idea that? Okay, so you had a pre-existing idea of what it was like, and then your visit there confirmed it. Is that fair to say? Okay. Anyone else feeling brave? Fair enough. So I guess with that as a background, that's sort of a really interesting entry point into why I do my particular research, is this idea of we have ideas about cities and what they mean and whether or not they're good, which we develop before we even go there a lot of the time. So I've never been to LA, but I have an idea of what LA is like. And those ideas can have functions in popular culture and in politics that are very different to the reality of what those cities can be like. And there can be a massive difference between what residents think of a city and what the wider culture and what politicians and what planners, for that matter, can think who are not actually involved in the city themselves. Which is important for people training to be planners, because it's sort of, in some ways, this case study shows you the limits of your own power, that you can do your absolute best to plan a city that is addresses all the problems that you can possibly think of addressing, and yet if the political context changes for that city, if the cultural context changes, then it may develop meanings and accrue meanings that are not what you intended. And so in some ways it shows the limits of your professional influence, but it also shows the need to adapt as well, because Milton Keynes is a great case study in adapting. And we, just as a way of framing this as well, our concept for this week is sort of backlash as a term. So that's something which has it's a metaphor which has a temporal dimension to it. So it has an idea of time embedded in the metaphor itself. It implies a trajectory of going one way. For the purposes of people listening to the recording, I'm making a sort of pendulum motion. It implies swinging one way, something happens to interrupt that trajectory, and then it swings back. So something, I mean, that's the narrative we're implying here, but this would be something to discuss in tutorials, particularly with regards to the readings. To what extent is backlash as a metaphor useful for describing the trajectory of urban planning, and for describing the wider politics as well of this period? So in order to understand Milton Keynes, I'll give a sense of what the forward momentum of this metaphor might mean. What's the relevant backstory that leads us to Milton Keynes and the idea that Milton Keynes could be a solution to anything? Because as we've heard, there are ideas that it might not be a solution to anything in some readings of the town. So we'll do some pre-1945, just very, very briefly, sort of contextualising the stuff that David's just given you. Talk a little bit about broader post-war British planning and what some of the problems were with that. And what I would strongly suggest, again, something fantastic to deal with in tutorials, would be to look at the narrative that we're giving here is, of course, Britain-focused, but it has parallels, I would say, in every other Western country at this time. So looking for those parallels and applying the broad principles of this narrative, and also looking at where it might not fit, would be a fantastic, would also make a fantastic tutorial paper that I would love to mark, so just a hint if you're still looking for something to write about. And we'll look at Milton Keynes in the sort of late 60s, early 70s context as an attempt by urban planners to sort of fix all the problems of planning so far, and what that involves, and whether or not that works. So we'll start with, this is basically the subject in a nutshell. So if anyone on the recording is in the future looking at this lecture for exam revision, that's a very good idea, and hello from the past. But we have this idea in Charlie and Newtown that we saw earlier today, that cities can become monsters when they're not regulated. So it doesn't use the word monster, but, well, it doesn't use the word octopus, for example, it uses monster, but the idea of London in particular as a sort of malformed monster spreading out over the countryside is very common in early 20th century descriptions of urban growth and of industrial capitalism in general.
Can I just mention while you're taking a sip there? Before,
Yeah.
when I typed Monarto into my phone, it auto-corrected it to monstrous. So I thought that was
Ooh, I like that. See, and when you're a cultural historian, you can take that kind of thing and make it run for about 10,000 words, so that's fantastic. I'm not sure I'm selling cultural history to all of you, but that's okay. So there is that sort of narrative that Charlie in Newtown as an, you know, as a cartoon implies, is that there is a process of sort of growing monstrosity that afflicts British cities. There are sort of experiments throughout the 19th century in trying to regulate and control various aspects of this. And so you get this intertwined history throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries of, on the one hand, the growing problems of cities, and also the growing of a literature and a field of scholarly expertise that's specifically about controlling that. So the growth of urban planning as a distinct field of knowledge is intrinsically tied up with the idea that cities as entities are changing, transforming, and in some ways decaying. And the main phases of this that are important are not just, I'm sure we're all sick of Ebenezer Howard by now, but as a model for post-war planning, it's very important to keep in the back of your mind. There's also issues sort of after Howard that become important for Milton Keynes and post-war planning in particular. So the idea that, as many of you wrote about in your tutorial papers, that no one garden city could fix all the problems of London. There was a need for a more systematic approach, particularly once you start getting wider adoption of the motor car, and particularly once you start getting the expansion of the tube or the London Underground and of railways in general. Which is what this book, England and the Octopus, refers to essentially, that sort of unregulated ribbon development growth in the 20s and 30s. There are some other experiments which we haven't had a chance to look at here, but some early, particularly after the First World War, experiments in the idea that the state should provide housing for particular people. So Homes for Heroes is one of those sort of post-war movements. The idea that if you fought in the war, and in the First World War this is, that you should be rewarded in some way for that effort. And they're sort of fairly small scale, but they are sort of linked to an expansion in the idea of what the state should do in terms of providing for the people who live there. Now, something we haven't had a chance to talk about too much yet in this subject is the significance of the Great Depression as something that leads into World War II. So when we talk about why do we talk about post-war planning as being a distinct or important phase, it's not just because the war was big, it's because you've essentially got, for most of the past 50 years, but definitely for the previous 20 years before 1945, you have a massive amount of economic and social trauma sort of coming in waves and waves over people. And that sort of, the Great Depression is significant because it is a global economic crisis. It prompts a sort of a change in a lot of people's thinking about what capitalism should do, what kind of regulation it might require. This is the period in which John Maynard Keynes starts doing his writing, for example. And it also creates the kind of economic conditions for the Second World War as well. So as you have a weakened global economic system, you've got mass poverty, that creates sort of political polarisation and so on, and creates the conditions for a kind of war which is historically very significant because it's what we call a total war. So unlike a war in which it's essentially just done by people in the army, you actually have the entire transformation of every aspect of society and the reorientation of every aspect of government and life, including civilian life, into fighting those wars. So this is where you get, women getting jobs in armaments factories, for example. You get rationing. You get the reorganisation of daily life through things like electricity blackouts and so on. So there isn't a sense that war is something that happens over here. War has become something that happens everywhere. And then, of course, you get the issues of civilian attacks, so bombing attacks, as David was talking about with Coventry, and also the issue of there are people on the front lines fighting these wars. So when you get to 1945, particularly in Britain, but this is definitely the case elsewhere, you get the level of psychological response to this sort of trajectory of sort of mass shocks and trauma repeatedly occurring over a long period of time. It's very hard to, it's quite hard to capture in some ways, but it's also something that's not often discussed with regards to being important for understanding post-war planning. But the idea of reconstruction can only really, I think, be understood from that perspective. Because otherwise, if it's just about rebuilding stuff that got knocked over, that doesn't account for any of the extent of the change that we see in post-1945 cities in the West. And it also doesn't account for the kinds of hopes and dreams that get tied up in that reconstruction idea. So in Britain, the problem is also the case that in 1945 you have the problems that specifically came from World War II, problems that arose from the Depression, and all the problems that people hadn't gotten a chance to fix before that as well. So you've got problems of Victorian era infrastructure that hasn't even been fixed. In fact, last time I was in London, there were signs up all around Waterloo because they were fixing Victorian water mains. So they were saying, look, we haven't actually changed these pipes since 1890. We have to close off access to your archive because we are finally getting around to changing those pipes. So infrastructure has a long history and legacy. They definitely didn't go around to fixing that in 1945. But so there were problems of overcrowding and all of the sort of public health issues that we've looked at, and no solution had yet been proposed on such an expansive scale that anything could be solved. And for the purposes of the lecture recording, that was me doing sort of quite tedious air quotes around the concept of solved, because as our tutors have talked about in particular, this idea that planning can solve things in a finite way is very optimistic and perhaps something that we need to be challenging as well. So in terms of what happens in 1945 and how we can understand what the problem of British cities looks like to the government, I find this quote particularly helpful. So this is the Minister of what was called Town and Country Planning at that point. And he's introducing the bill that is going to become the basis for new town planning. It's a very long speech. It's all available on Hansard online. So I welcome, if anyone's particularly interested, it is well worth having a look at. But this is a very bold sort of statement of what the intention of urban planning is. We may well produce in the new towns a new type of citizen. So that emphasis is my own that I've added there. But the idea is that after all of these traumas, after all of the massive destruction and reorganisation of society in the previous decades, that we now have a moment and an opportunity to transform not just bombed out cities like Coventry, but to really change the kind of people who live in the country by creating new environments for them. And that involves drawing on the new technology or science that urban planning is becoming. So this photo is from the promotional documents for Stevenage, which was the, as we saw, being discussed in Charlie and Newtown. But something that comes up a lot in the literature reading about this period is the word technocracy. And so essentially the idea that it's sort of the flip side of the trauma and the shock mentality of 1945. You don't have a sort of a nihilist response to that when, you know, everything humans do is terrible. You do have that among some people. But in terms of government action, you have a sense of, okay, well, we have this new disciplinary knowledge with people who have best practice solutions. Why don't we use those solutions to create a new and better society? There's a belief that technology will save us, or will save them. And it draws on, it's not just planning that's involved in this. So disciplines like sociology, disciplines like, even for example, in the immediate post-war context in Britain, you get the development of the National Health Service, for example. So that's the most prominent vision of the post-war state that is still vaguely in existence, in a shape that sort of resembles what it was intended as. But the idea that the role of the state is now to provide for the health of the people who live there, and that so it's drawing on new sort of technologies and also drawing on a new belief about what governments should do and who they should do it for. And that the intention behind this is partly to prevent things like the Great Depression and the Second World War happening ever again. So the idea is if you create a situation where people are reasonably housed, reasonably fed, that you won't have revolutions, for example. You won't risk something like the Russian Revolution of 1917 happening, but you also won't risk people becoming displeased to the point that they start to elect fascists, for example, as you have the case in Germany. And some of this involves a sense that capitalism was complicit in creating the Great Depression, obviously, but then that the Great Depression was complicit in starting the Second World War, so we may need to create more of a role for the state as a sort of buffer against the most extreme impacts of capitalism on people. So what does this mean for planning? This is a more colourful map of the one that David put up before. There are multiple. New town planning is not the only urban planning solution to these broader social problems that's put forward. It is a big one though. So part of the issue is not just overcrowding and so on after the Second World War in England. It's also things like who can access good jobs, who can access where is industry located, how can we reorganise things perhaps in a way that's more efficient, how can we make the economy less reliant on London so that if something terrible happens again, not everything is, you know, all the eggs of the economy are not placed in the one geographical basket. It's a terrible metaphor, but that's the kind of underpinning to the idea of this kind of decentralisation. And greenbelt planning is sort of the flip side of that. Peter Hall framed this in his writing as being sort of the cordon sanitaire idea, that you can only have new towns if you are putting something in place to stop sprawl, meaning that the new town just becomes subsumed within the wider metropolis or mega metropolis as it might be. That you can only really decentralise if you're putting some kind of constraint around urban space as well. So these are really two parts of the same process here. So these are mainly greenfield sites, as David mentioned, that you pick a small village and you transform it into a town. This is done by specific government bodies, so you'll have what's called a development corporation. It's not done by the local councils in most instances. There are other things that are done by councils. And the idea is, especially around London, you do see a little bit of the Garden City model creeping in as an inspiration, not as an application. There is a little bit of a pizza wheel idea. If you look at how many new towns there are in the sort of immediate northern area of London, that's deliberate. And the greenfield or the green belt that's shown there is now sort of, it keeps getting whittled away at. The green belt that exists now is not anywhere near this extensive. But this was sort of the idea that having sort of clusters of new towns rather than one was going to be something that helped. So this is a still from Charlie earlier on. But in addition to new towns, you have a range of other solutions that are going on alongside. So one of those is what is frequently called slum clearances. So, you know, with heavy quotation marks around it. But there is an idea that even in cities that weren't bombed like Coventry, that urban decay should be swept away and replaced by better facilities. Much of which was, and part of better facilities involved more efficient facilities. And part of more efficient facilities meant using the space more effectively. So you do get a massive and very quick uptake of high-rise. I should have referenced it here, but I didn't. And so I will mention now that Patrick Dunleavy's book from 1981 on this is still one of the best references for how this played out in practice. There's also Tower Block by Miles Glendinning, which is very useful for talking about how quickly British cities were transformed in the sense of having very visible modernist architecture, very visible high-rise architecture, most of which was residential at a certain point. And this idea was partly to provide better social housing for people on low incomes, more efficient social housing. It's sort of a vaguely Le Corbusier-inspired machine for living mentality of if we create, we build up and create sort of green spaces around these towers, then it will sort of maximise the utility of the space. We also see local governments negotiating around Britain to sort of build little expanded estates from the outside of their town. So the perfect example of this is Swindon. Swindon looks like a new town in a lot of ways, but it was never actually a formal new town. What it had was just a very enthusiastic local government. So Swindon is about halfway, give or take, between Bristol and London, draw a line that way. And they just negotiated with a lot of London governments to fund the construction of estates that decanted population from London was the term that was used, and used that to sort of reimagine and rebuild the industry of Swindon, which had been sort of a declining railway town. And so you get sort of, rather than it being an unregulated sprawling of Swindon, you get a very planned and deliberate building of expanding overspill estates, as they were called, to do that. So these are sort of, new towns were not the only solution to post-war planning, but they were part of a suite of ideas that really involved the reimagining of cities as they existed, as well as creating new ones entirely. So back to new towns, because Milton Keynes is of course a new town, so it's the most important context for that. There are three phases of new town planning, so these terms will come up in the literature. Most of the ones that were, so Charleyan New Town is, we're talking about Stevenage, which is a Mark I new town. One of the things when you look at the plan of Stevenage in that cartoon is that it is not designed with flexible land use in mind. The most important thing to keep in mind, I think, is again a Peter Hall quote from Seas of Tomorrow, a belief that you could get it right the first time. That sort of urban planning as a discipline, believing that it had the tools to get it right, and that didn't necessarily need to evolve or change. So you get quite a tight master planning taking place in Mark I new towns particularly. So that creates little space for things to adapt over time, and it also creates little space for experimentation. So, for example, you don't put in enough childcare facilities, then it's very difficult to sort of retrofit those kinds of facilities back into a design that doesn't have that kind of flexibility built into it. New towns were populated mainly through council activity, so using council waiting lists for social housing. They would also pull industry, there would be industry initiatives or incentives to decentralise. So, for example, Hemel Hempstead had the Kodak factory, and it essentially became a Kodak factory town for a long period of time. So if you lived in Hemel Hempstead, you would work in the film factory there for much of its early history. These things weren't as well coordinated as they could be. So you get a situation where the people who were most mobile moved to those new towns, which tends to be people who were doing better to start with. So you get a situation where people who are left in inner cities tend to be what we would call less skilled working class people. That's usually, it's a very fraught term because it usually just implies a particular set of skills that are valued by the industry of the time. But it also means that middle class people are more able to benefit from new towns. That was the intention. Part of Silkin's utopian vision, as we saw earlier, was to create a social mix as part of that new kind of citizen, which was not always successful in early new towns because it was not as coordinated as effectively as it could have been. Mark II new towns, as they're called, includes Cumbernauld, which is the example that David described earlier. And these are much more sort of experimental in their form. They tend to focus more on sort of low-rise, high-density design. There's having a look at this particular book is from the Architecture Library here at the in the MSD building, are some fantastic images of sort of quite experimental housing, trying to give people access to gardens while still maintaining quite a centralised and high density plan overall. The problem with these kinds of experimentations is that when you do them with people who actually have to live there, and you might not have the capacity to change them, it can create some cultural antipathy to people who are being told how to live. So on one hand, while I've described a sort of overall trajectory and a cultural belief from the top in what urban planning should do and be like, that's not the only set of ideas and attitudes that we can see at this time. So as much as governments, the civil service, urban planners themselves are quite enthusiastic about a particular set of ideas, in Britain in particular, there is a very wide-ranging set of critiques that are escalating over the period from 1945 onwards. So some of this is due to the very drastic visual changes that take place in existing cities. So if you have had virtually no modernist architecture in British cities before 1945, and then suddenly it drastically transforms very quickly, a lot of people experience that as shocking. A lot of people experience that as, particularly where it involved the demolition of older buildings, experienced it as a kind of, as a rejection of the idea of what made Britain great. So this is all said with heavy asterisks and quotation marks around it and so on, but this is a country that's quite culturally obsessed with the idea of its own greatness, which was, of course, as we've seen and will continue to see, largely obtained through colonising other places. But they tend to think of it, culturally speaking, as being imbued within the oldness of their own buildings. So if the idea of embracing newness is something that develops as a, not just on the right, but also on the left, is something that might involve rejecting something that makes British culture good or special or ideal. There's also one of the issues with Newtown dispersal in Britain was that there was very limited use of social programs to integrate new arrivals. So you get a sort of a literature developing around the concept of Newtown blues, which takes on a sort of life of its own as a concept, but is always worth reading with a sort of a heavy degree of scepticism, because if you look at studies about the psychological impact of moving to a new place without any sort of social support, no matter where you are, then there is usually a sense of disconnection, malaise and so on that affects people who do that. The thing is with new towns is you have a lot of people moving at the same time, and a lot of needs, social integration needs that aren't being met. And then when you have that issue of not being able to very easily adapt new towns that perhaps misread the needs of the new population, you can't necessarily change them as easily when you don't have flexible land use built into the plans. I love the cover of this book, even though it's a bit of an odd book. This is an American book after the planners, but it was very popular in Britain. So this is a cheap paperback edition that you could buy pretty much anywhere. And the foreword is written by a British planner. So one of the main things to keep in mind is the Cold War context for all of this stuff. It's often imagined, or described rather, that this is a socialist period of British politics. Relatively speaking, that would perhaps be the case in the sense that it has an idea that the state should do things like make sure people have houses and make sure that they have healthcare and so on, if that constitutes socialist. But it was also a very paternalistic model. And one of that was partly deliberate because in Western countries in general during this time, you don't want to let people participate too much because then you create, that starts straying too close to communism and start giving people too much political influence. It was seen as being a little bit too close for comfort to some of the political models that you saw, say, for example, in Soviet Russia, the USSR rather. So there was a deliberate attempt to not consult with people extensively. on an ideological level. This is not to say that planners thought that deliberately and explicitly at the time, but this was the sort of cultural underpinning to why these policies were being put in place. And you also have this idea that it's okay to demolish working class housing, for example, because they don't really have a culture. That the only culture that matters is white middle class culture, that you get to sort of educate working class people into better ways of living. That's of course the undertone of Silkin's quote that we saw earlier, that we're going to have better kinds of working class citizens now, that they're going to be living in new and better places. But what that means is that you get the destruction of existing social networks as people are being moved around, you get the destruction of buildings and ways of life that people might be attached to, and you're also not asking them to what extent they might want those things changed, or if they want them changed, how they should be changed. So one particularly influential example of this is a book called Family and Kinship in East London. This is a sociological study which has, is perhaps more significant for its influence than for the quality of its analysis. Maybe that's a slightly unkind way of putting it. But this is the kind of thing that any sociologist would sort of dream of, to the extent that, again, this is a cheap paperback that anyone can buy. It's very widely read by people who are not academics. It's very widely written about in newspapers and so on. It's very influential. They have other books that make similar points. The idea of this book is essentially looking at the impact of relocation of working class populations to new fringe, new build sort of planning solutions, and finding that that can have an adverse social impact, and that there is a lack of consultation, essentially. And so I bring this up particularly because it shows this is not just that the idea, the political motivations for critiquing post-war urban planning up to 1970 are not just right-wing ones. The right, of course, have a Conservative Party, have a sort of, they do participate in funding some of these, this isn't really a party political position. It was a sort of consensus that some kind of new town planning needed to take place. And similarly to how both left and right were politically believing in the need for this kind of change, you also get critiques from both the left and the right as well. So people who are really interested in more agency for working class people, and people who are interested in the reassertion of a particular conservative politics as well, are both critiquing post-war planning at this period. So this is the part of planning history that often gets forgotten and missed out entirely if you read most standard planning history texts. That's why I'm very excited to get to talk about it. So often the way it's framed in a sort of classic planning history model is that from 1945 to about, say, 1973, there's a very uniform supposed model of urban planning that goes on. Then something happens. No one particularly is very interested in the classic planning history narrative of what happens, but something happens, and then suddenly urban planning has a very different form. Planners have a very different level of influence, and so on. So what I would like to do is give a little bit more of a narrative of how in Britain, how that change occurs and why it occurs. So in 1964, in Britain, you get the election of the Wilson government. So this is a Labor government. Harold Wilson was young by the standards of the time. I think he was 40. And he was from the north, so he was a bit of an outsider figure, or that's how he was viewed. And the idea was that that he was essentially relaunching the Labor policies of the time under the concept of, the quote that was used from his campaigning was the white heat of technology. So we're going to reboot the post-war state with a fresh injection of technological expertise. And what this involves with regards to urban planning is an expansion of the idea of what participation might mean. So there are some early government papers looking at how can we make planning more receptive to people's needs, how can we improve the existing models that have seemed to have perhaps failed or perhaps not met people's needs as well as they could. How can we do better? How can we continue to provide housing and so on, but actually do it in a way that is doesn't just ameliorate the problems of the past experiments in planning, in state planning of this nature, but also prevents new problems from happening as well. So culturally in the late 60s, that's the kind of mentality. It's about reflecting on what's been done and how can we make it better in the future. And so this is the context of non-plan you're reading for this week. So that's one very specific experimental thought experiment really in what direction planning might take in a way that is more participatory in some ways, that is more about meeting people where they are rather than enforcing an idea on them. And for Milton Keynes, as an important piece of context, you have a second Newtown Act. Legislatively, they didn't need a second Newtown Act, but they made one anyway. And that's significant because it shows that there was that desire to sort of reboot post-war planning models was really ingrained. And the new towns that were designated under the second Newtown Act are very different. So you have two what are called expanded towns. Peterborough and Northampton were sort of fairly middle-sized regional cities, and they are heavily expanded, but with much more of a focus on integrating the new and the old parts of the city. So that's a new model of new town planning that is experimented with there. And then there's one more, and that's Milton Keynes. So that is designated on the 13th of January 1967. It is designated, and from the minute that it's designated, it's clear that it's going to be very different to the towns that have gone before. And part of this is because that in the lead up to the designation of Milton Keynes, the Labor government ministers have been meeting with planners from the Centre for Environmental Studies, a sort of very hip think tank based in the University College London. And their model was trying to reimagine what planning can do, essentially, by drawing on sociological research as well as best practice planning. And their model of thinking about planning was not as a top-down process, but was something which had to have a social element built into it. So, and the main way we can see that when Milton Keynes is designated is that it's designated over an extremely large area. So this is where we're talking about, just in order for you to orient yourselves. Essentially halfway between London and Birmingham and halfway between Oxford and Cambridge. It's designated around some small regional towns and a number of small villages. The name comes from the village of Milton Keynes, which is smack in the middle of the designated area. It's now called Middleton, just to avoid confusion of what you mean when you're talking about Milton Keynes. And it's a big experiment from the start. So you've got 250,000 people. It hasn't actually reached 250,000 people yet in terms of its population. But at the time, that was the target that was set for it. And it was, even despite this large number, because the designated area was so large, it was clear that it was meant to be a low-density city and also a low-rise city, with just the way in which it was set out as a model. So construction doesn't start for quite a while in Milton Keynes, but what's interesting in the early years is the way that they undertake consultation. So what they do many of the things that are now considered to be best practice, in fact a lot better than what considered to be best practice, to the extent that the number of notes and minutes of the meetings they have with local people are extremely extensive. Every week to 2 weeks you would have meetings with all of the local people from all of the villages in the area. What they also did was they published an interim version of their plan in book form and circulated it not just to the people who lived there, but to all of the major university planning departments in Britain. We have copies in Australia, to local libraries, all the big national news outlets got a copy. And the idea was that they published a copy of their plan halfway through so that anyone who was interested could provide them with feedback, which is really interesting. I'm going to bring in a copy of that to the tutes this week as well, so it's worth having a look at. In terms of the philosophy, before we start looking at the actual plan itself, philosophy of Milton Keynes is very interesting. So this is a quote from the plan, and it really reads like a manifesto. I encourage you to read it. I have a link to it, the e-copy of it we have in the library, in the final slide, I believe. But it really sort of sets out where it, as a document, the plan sets out where it believes Milton Keynes is going to fit in history, in terms of planning history. And then it comes to this idea of what they're trying to do. And that involves imposing no fixed idea of how people ought to live, which in the historical context of British planning and British Newtown planning and urban planning in general is extremely ambitious and extremely bold. Basically, they go on to reject the very idea of determinism rather, as a concept throughout the plan. So I do encourage you to have, it's sort of a very uplifting read, even if there's sort of, it describes a world which might not have come to pass in some of the predictions it makes. In terms of what this looks like in practice, I'll have a few explanatory images of this to start with. Does this work? Excellent. So this is the designated area of Milton Keynes. This is an image from the final plan. So what we have here, this is the M1 motorway, the first motorway that was built in Britain. It goes up along here. There are three sort of existing towns that it joins up. So we have Stony Stratford here, which is a sort of a little old market town. Wolverton, an old railway town here. Bletchley, which was a sort of another regional market town here. We have this grid system that is imposed not as an attempt to sort of cut up existing villages. So you've got sort of villages dotted through here. The idea is to use the grid roads to protect the existing villages. So, for example, Wolfton on the Green, which is a village that is mainly sort of thatched roof housing, is over here. And when you go from off one of these grid roads into Wolfton, you feel like you've taken a step back to the 17th century and you don't know you're in the middle of a large town. The grid roads are to divert main traffic away from local areas to create a sort of neighbourhood idea or feeling to the local areas. The main roads are also have separated pedestrian facilities. So you have a sort of a network of what they call redways, because they're sort of a dark red paving cutting through the town, which diverts, is sort of used for sort of cycling and so on, and is basically just as, if not more, extensive than this grid here. This straight road here, incidentally, is the Roman road Watling Street. So Milton Keynes is often sort of critiqued or judged for being excessively formulaic and straight in its grid. The straightest road in Milton Keynes is a Roman road. So, but as we'll see, there's a gap between facts and reality in a lot of the representations of the town here. So the idea is that there's a sort of infill planning that happens in here to join up existing conurbations, or not really conurbations, but existing settlements. But also you'll notice that you don't need to pay particular attention to which colour matches up to what. But what's important at this stage is that there is a decentralisation within Milton Keynes itself. There is still a centre, this, for example, with the major shopping centres and so on. But there is, in a sense, that the zoning in practice really disperses facilities of all kinds within every single grid square, and that was part of the intention. And part of that is to make sure that literally everyone, no matter where you live in Milton Keynes, has a choice for everything they do. You don't have to go to the one shop that's in your area because it's the only shop. The idea is, by making sure that the facilities within each grid square, which functionally act like small suburbs, they're placed on the edges of the squares so that they're easy to get to via the grid roads. But the idea is also that you've got a choice no matter where you are. So there is schools and housing mixed in within each of these squares. There's also industrial choice. So every grid square has an industrial section. And by section, I sometimes mean a street or two streets where there might be, it tends not to be factory based, but there are some factories through there. And that means in terms of traffic flow as well, that you don't really ever have traffic jams in Milton Keynes, partly because of those roundabouts, which are located at these grid roads here, which were designed to increase traffic flow, but also because you don't have everyone going in the same way at any given time. You get sort of an even dispersal of traffic flows. It's very interesting from that perspective. And this philosophy of planning was to create a situation where no matter where you lived, you were not being told how to live. And this also includes housing styles as well. So that the idea was that you, even as a council housing resident, you were going to be encouraged to change your home to fit what you needed, and that you would have a choice of homes and a choice of places and ways to live as well. So you could live in a bungalow, as the British call it, basically a detached house. You could live in semi-detached housing. You could live in a flat if you wanted to. And these choices would also be extended to aged care. There's a really interesting history yet to be written about aged care planning in Milton Keynes, which, again, if you want to write a tutorial paper, it would be very interesting. I look forward to marking it. But the idea was that aged care was something that you would, and childcare for that matter, would all be dispersed equally throughout the city as well. There wouldn't be sort of, segregated areas where older people would live, but that everyone would have a chance to sort of mix in their local communities. And this is a slightly less effective model, but it also shows how buses were the main sort of transport focus at this time. Part of that was because of flexibility. Train lines were seen as, or light rail lines were seen as being slightly more deterministic, whereas a bus you can change and reroute and go all kinds of different places. They can go on the main roads, they can go on the, obviously within each square you'll have lots of smaller suburban roads, like not major roads like this, but the buses can sort of weave in and out and sort of sew up areas that way. And there were massive problems with implementing buses for various reasons which weren't entirely in the control of the planners. But this was the kind of, I mentioned this to give you a sense of what they were thinking and why they were thinking it. But even in a decentralised city, the idea was that you could have choice and flexibility, and that would be a sort of a freeing dimension to the city, and it would also mean that the residents, once they got there, would be able to shape the city how they wanted it to be. And part of this was done. This is a sheet from that was handed out to local residents as they moved in. There were very extensive social facilities for moving in at Milton Keynes. They're called arrivals offices. Basically, everyone had a social worker the minute you turned up. And they would put you in charge of, well, they wouldn't put you in charge, but they would get you in touch with, rather, local community groups, which were funded by the Development Corporation, but which the Development Corporation didn't administer. And there was also a big drive to get, again, mainly working class residents to take part in shaping what they wanted the city to look like. So part of that was doing education on why the plan was planned in a particular way. But also, as you can see here, this was, most of the grid roads have very large green verges, which as we heard before, can make it hard to navigate if you're not used to it. On the other hand, it does mean there's a huge amount of green space built into the plan, which can be then reused or built on or infilled as the occasion requires. So just a couple of weeks ago, Milton Keynes, for example, has now going to be the site of one of the newest universities in Britain. They could do that because they had the space put aside. They didn't know what they'd put it aside for. It was a beautiful green open space, which a lot of people were using to walk their dogs and play footy. And now it's going to be used for university. But this kind of what can look like a very inefficient use of space creates space for flexibility, and that was part of the intention. What's also interesting is the monitoring and feedback system. So not only do the arrivals officers sort of help you settle in, they also administer a system of constantly seeing how you're feeling, how are you doing, how are we doing as a development corporation, what can we do better? So as residents, you have lots of opportunities all the time to be providing feedback on what you want. So for example, one area that had flat roof housing, this one here, I'll go back to this slide, they really hated the flat roofs. So they all complained about it, and then they got pitched roofs on their housing. These kinds of things were possible, and that wasn't even viewed as being a bad idea. That was sort of part of how the process was meant to work. And as I mentioned before, the Development Corporation had a big interest in trying to facilitate cultural and social activities which they didn't administer themselves. So they would do things like hire artists in residence who would then go and organise classes and sort of community festivals and so on in order to get working class people involved in creating the culture of the area. This happened with music as well. They had experimental local TV stations where anyone could come in and take part. They would fund the making of newsletters and so on. So the idea, they saw themselves as facilitating rather than controlling these things. So provide the funding, provide the means, and the idea was that the residents would then take the lead. And then they would publish the outcomes as well. So this sheet comes from a book that was published just as widely as the plan was. We have a copy here, I believe. I quite love these images.
I have a question, Lauren.
Yeah.
It's probably just stupid, but the want to go back column, that means want to go back to where they came from. They want to leave.
Yes, it does.
It's confusing.
Yeah, I just like the sad face.
I know, it's great.
The smiley face.
It's here.
Yeah, well, with regards to childcare, in the same book, they use little teddy bears instead of smiley faces to map out. It's very cute. 1970s plan design is just cool, so I recommend planning history on that basis alone. You get to look at some great graphics. And you get to look at great photos, like these cool people here, sitting in front of the house. So that's sort of, these were the intentions of the Milton Keynes planners, and to some extent they get to enact some of them, to some extent, throughout the early 1970s in particular. And so they also very heavily promote the towns, because you have to make sure you actually have people living there. And with a high population target like that, you've got to pull in population quite quickly. And what they do is they try and promote themselves as being unlike any other planning that's ever been seen before, which is where my thesis comes in, talking about that process. They specifically market themselves as not being like those terrible tower blocks that are so deterministic. They market themselves as being much more flexible than every other new town, for example. And they also do some things like try rudimentarily, that's how you say it, to make jokes, which is always a risk for academics and there's a risk for urban planners as well. So this is a sheet, a quote from one of their documents from the 70s, which shows planners trying to be funny, but it also shows there, within that, a sense of what they think people think about urban planning at this time. So this is from 1975, and I'll read it out. It is fairly widely accepted that planners are not human, but mechanical beings exercising infinite power from subterranean vaults, where they gorge on statistics fed to them by computers and make a series of decisions couched in peculiar jargon and contrive to inconvenience the lives of every one of us. So the idea is that they're satirising a vision of what planning is and what planners do. And then they go on to show sort of various groovy photos of how we're not really like that. We talk to people and so on. So I'll bring in that magazine to my chicks as well, so get a chance to have a look at those great photos. And just great trousers in the 1970s, fantastic trousers. But this is, so the idea that Milton Keynes is an attempt to fix urban planning's problems and model a new way of doing things is really core to the self-image of the Development Corporation at this time as well. And a lot of their advertising focuses on trying to educate people. And that's mainly because they were starting to develop a reputation as being not different to existing urban planning, but in fact a symbol of the worst kind of urban planning, with no change at all. So there's a big gap from what the plan is trying to do on the ground and how the town is being seen and received in the politics of the time. So they try very valiantly to educate people and say, no, we're actually very flexible. We're actually trying to help people. The reason for this political change, we've touched on so far. We'll talk about it a little bit more in week 10, which in many ways, my lecture in week 10 is like a part 2 of this lecture. But this is the part of the narrative that often gets skipped over in planning history. And it really comes down to the politics of the 1970s. And the sort of the cultural change which underpins the economic changes of the 1970s. A lot of people have written their tutorial papers on neoliberalism so far, so most of this will be sort of familiar to you in a bare bones structure for those people. But what's important to consider is that the cultural belief in what the state should do and in what can be done by the state and by urban planners changes extremely drastically, extremely quickly. And that's specifically due to the economic crises, as they're called, of the 1970s. What's important to think of in terms of Britain is that these are definitely major economic events, but the way in which they're responded to doesn't always match their actual severity in terms of the actual economic events that are occurring. And so in the same way that we can see there's the actual problems created by the Second World War and so on, and then a sort of a psychological or a cultural shift that accompanies that, there's a similar thing going on in the 70s. So there are genuine economic problems that occur on a global scale. But the cultural response is not, gee, this is bad, let's maybe tinker with the existing system and see what helps. The cultural response is, let's throw away everything. That the fact that there has been an economic crisis means that the entire system of post-war state planning and governance has failed. And the sense was that it had failed. And in British culture, this was tied up with a sense of, we are now humiliated, we are no longer great as a nation. So there's a very big sort of cultural crisis that accompanies things that are in themselves not potentially as crisis-laden as they might sound. So, for example, countries get loans from the International Monetary Fund all the time. Very common. When Britain gets one in 1976, there is a sense that the word apocalyptic gets used to describe the media culture at this time. There is literally a sense in a lot of the mainstream media that Britain is going to somehow disappear because they've needed to get a loan. It's very hard to explain without looking at, but I've got some links to some very interesting things in the further reading if you want to follow this as well. So the cultural belief system changing is really that technocracy has failed, that there were all of these utopian promises made at the end of the Second World War, and that system cannot be reformed. So that while Milton Keynes is trying to do its reforming, it's also in a situation where governments, and this is a Labor government at the time, I'm talking about pre-Margaret Thatcher here, the Labor government at the time sort of gives up on the idea that the Milton Keynes planners are believing in. They don't believe that you can reform the post-war state anymore. The Prime Minister, James Callaghan, actually basically says that in a very famous speech, that we no longer believe that we can make the world better in this way. So what this means for planning is that the funding dries up from the state. There is a planned Newtown which gets cut completely. Stonehouse, so a very similar case to Monarto. Again, chewed paper, right on a comparison of that, I would love it. Milton Keynes is at a funny stage in its development though. It's considered too far along to be cancelled. That there's too much of it that's been built. So it has to continue to receive funding in order to make sense of what's on the ground. That was the quote. And so it's in this sort of limbo zone. So what happens is that it's now the most visible recipient of public funding at a historical time in which the idea of state funding is now seen as being the cause of national problems. This makes Milton Keynes very prominent in media and popular culture as a butt of jokes and a subject for criticism. I'll skip this because I'll cover this next week. So, in week 10 rather. What this means though is that Milton Keynes has found itself in an ideological environment that's completely different to the one that created it and has to adapt somehow. Some of the ways in which it adapts is by embracing an association with consumer capitalism. It opens a very large and famous shopping building. It embraces a lot of IT infrastructure. This building I just mainly put up in here for architects to explore. It's a really interesting example of shopping building design if you're into these things. It is heritage listed. There is a video here which uses the shopping building as a point of promotion. This video is of a TV advertisement from 1983, which was sort of played on such a loop that it is still one of the things that people most associate with Milton Keynes in popular culture. They also associated themselves with things like the first multiplex cinema in Britain, which is built in this building, which is pretty cool, but which did not get heritage listing and is about to be demolished, which is very sad. But they sort of reimagined themselves economically, and in terms of they sort of privatise themselves as much as they can as a development corporation. They embrace private sector construction, and then that sort of backfires on them as well, because Margaret Thatcher actually personally really liked Milton Keynes. When she visited these houses on the right, she actually said that she wished she had one. They actually become associated with suburban-style consumer capitalism because they overcompensate culturally in order to survive and continue to receive funding as well. So you go in 10 years from Milton Keynes becoming a symbol of being a symbol of socialism to Milton Keynes becoming a symbol of everything that's bad about consumer capitalism, which is a very interesting sort of cultural process to follow, and that's sort of what my research looks at. But what this means is that you've got this very contested space, which people who live there are sort of caught up in that. Most people who live in Milton Keynes live there because they want to and because they think it's nice. And that's not to say, you know, there are criticisms and so on, but the idea of what Milton Keynes is has had very different political functions that have affected the way in which the space has been seen. So I'll blast through this so we've got time for questions, but what's really interesting is that all of this early cultural work that was laid down in the plan for Milton Keynes is still created. There's a very unique culture of local participation in Milton Keynes politics. They often decide things by referendum, for example, local referendums on major changes. Everyone is extremely involved in the planning process still, even though those kind of development corporation systems aren't there anymore, but because the culture was fostered so early on. And that last year was the 50th anniversary of the designation of Milton Keynes. It's a great example of this because even though Milton Keynes hasn't been a new town for a long time, it's still sort of seen as new by a lot of people. It's still sort of seen as not having history. But what was really interesting to see was that in 2017, this was partly sponsored by the town's sort of council and heritage organisations and so on, but there's basically an entire year of parties and celebrations and festivals to celebrate the 50th year of the town. And I'll bring in some of the merchandise of that because it's really interesting. The idea that the local population was really interested in celebrating the town as having heritage and as being a good place to live. And it did receive some really interesting media coverage as well. This is just a photo of what it looks like from the air as of 5 years ago. This is where the main shopping centre is. This is that snow dome that we mentioned earlier, the indoor skiing slope where you can have a drink in the bar and watch people fall over if that's what you want to do. So as you can see, it is still very low rise as a town, but also look how green it is. All of these linear parks and joining up There's a wood just over here, which is just out of vision. And this is sort of what it looks like last time I was there. So this is the archive I did my research in, which is a 13th century abbey. This is where two places I used to live, some examples of the housing. It doesn't really look that different to most suburban British housing. But if you try and tell someone who is British that, they will sort of fall over and then sputter with shock. But the idea that Milton Keynes is different is very culturally important still today. And Milton Keynes is still advertising itself and still trying to show itself as being better than what people might believe. So this is some of the 2017 advertising. I find the one in the middle hilarious. That's obviously what some planners think is really cool. But the whole advertising, this is basically very similar to the 80s advertising, where they're sort of saying, look, you might have these ideas about the town, but come and have a look, because it's actually quite different. So why does this matter? It matters because the way in which urban planning is seen, state-sponsored post-war urban planning is seen, has a very active political life, not just in Britain, but also in Australia, in the present. The entire political careers are made around saying that post-war planning is bad. We saw this in Britain recently. A planning minister, or transport minister rather, decided he was going to declare war on brutalism in 2016. Someone needs to tell him that maybe that's not declaring a war on a historical architectural movement might be quite difficult to do. But it was very politically opportune for him to do. It's also an important, it functions in the present by allowing the present system of politics, the present systems of planning that we'll discuss in historical perspective in the next few weeks, it presents them as being the only way things can be. So you can't go back to the bad old days, supposedly. Bad old days is often used as an exact quote from Boris Johnson, who likes to call the 1970s the bad old days. So this constant demonisation of 1970s planning has a lot of functions today, but it also means that it constrains the way in which planners today can learn from the recent past. It is very interesting from my perspective. For example, when I get to mark all your tute papers, a lot of people are really interested in Portland, Oregon, for example. The number of times that I see examples of supposedly new things that people are doing in Portland, and I'm like, well, Milton Keynes did that in 1972. But so this idea that the ideas of what planners can learn from gets constrained by contemporary politics. So this is why it's really important to keep in mind a sort of critical perspective on ideas of good and bad planning and how those can change over time. And I have some future reading as well. My thesis is embargoed because I'm turning it into a book, but if you want a copy, I can email you if you're interested in any of the sources or anything like that. And these are some of the things that I'll talk about in week 10, but if you want to get a heads up, start reading now. Does anyone have any questions before we get out of here? I'm here all the time, so you can ask me another time. Also, I mentioned the words "get out of here," which is always a little bit dangerous.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lauren. I think that was
Cool.
fantastic, as always. And when is the book? What's the book story?
I've got to write it,
Yeah?
and I don't know when it's going to come out because I've been writing it.
That's not how publishing works. So.
It is actually. You have to write it first.
Have you signed the contract?
Yeah.
What did the contract tell you?
The contract says I have to finish it by June.
June. Okay. So it'll be out in July.
Hopefully at the end of the year there'll be a book.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, everybody. See you next week.
I just sort of assumed since you said you'd hold stuff over the next week that I'd spend more time on the plan. So I
Totally.
normally get 20 emails about it afterwards, so that's my... There's a theory I realised I should have mentioned to you in advance.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That was great. That was great. Why did I ever think